The sagas speak of shield maidens with bright steel in their hands, women who stepped onto the battlefield beside men and carved their names into legend. But beneath the poetry lies a harsher truth. Viking women who entered the realm of war did so in a world shaped by necessity, blood-bound duty, and the quiet understanding that survival demanded more than strength, it demanded sacrifice. Their lives were marked by blurred lines between myth and memory. Some trained from youth, wielding axes in hidden clearings. Others were pressed into war when their homesteads burned, and the men who once defended them fell under foreign blades. Their stories were whispered in longhouses, preserved in fragments across runestones, sagas, and the accounts of terrified monks who witnessed the fury of northern warriors. Yet many tales were softened, reshaped, or buried by time. This documentary reimagines their world, merging historical fragments with narrative reconstruction to reveal the darker truths behind their choices, their battles, and the roles they carried long after the fighting stopped. These women were not symbols, they were survivors. Their reality was harsher, more complex, and more human than legend allows. The settlement of Kvjørgjord lay quiet beneath the weight of another Norwegian winter, its longhouses dusted with frost that glimmered faintly in the pale light before sunrise. In this region of Rogaland, the year 893 had already become a point of uneasy reference among the villagers, a reminder that tension was growing across the coast. Sigrid Halfdansdottir rose from her bedding. As the embers of the hearth dulled into a soft orange glow, she moved through the longhouse with the practiced steps of someone who understood that silence was often more dependable than certainty. Her father Halfdan had left before dawn with her younger brother Leif, carrying spears wrapped in wool as though preparing for something more than routine training. Her mother Brynhild had been summoned even earlier to assist the seeress Yrsa for a ritual known as the Vegra Lokun, a ceremony rarely performed except in years when the threat of raids or clan conflict pressed close to the fjords. As Sigrid rekindled the fire and stirred a pot of barley porridge, she noticed an object placed carefully beside the hearth, a training shield, newly reinforced along its rim. The iron boss had been polished until it reflected the flickering light. It was not her father's shield, nor her brother's. The size and weight made its purpose unmistakable. It had been prepared for her. The gesture unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Women in Kvjord did train occasionally, but only in response to necessity, and only under circumstances the elders did not openly discuss. The last widespread training of women had occurred in 885, after the destruction of Njarðvík by raiders from Jylland, an event still described in lowered voices around the communal fires. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, Astrid Eriksdottir stood waiting, breath forming a faint mist in the cold air. Astrid was one of the few women recognized as a trained fighter, a veteran of the expeditions led by Bjorn Ketilsson during the coastal raids of 889 and 891. The long scar tracing her jaw had become a story in itself across the settlement, a reminder of how often legends originated from wounds rather than victories. She did not waste words. "You were summoned," Astrid said, nodding toward the shield. "Bring it. The others are waiting in Skjoldring." Sigrid followed her through the snow-lined pathways, passing early risers who paused in their work to observe the pair. The air held a stillness that accompanied winters when uncertainty pressed against the borders of routine. The trail beyond the palisade wound toward the forest clearing, a place where warriors trained beneath trees older than the stories recited in the longhouse. As they neared the clearing, Sigrid saw a gathering of villagers arranged in a wide circle. Some carried spears, others shields. Several bore the marks of earlier battles. Among them stood Hakon Grimsson, known for having served in the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872, when King Harald Fairhair secured his claim to unify Norway. His presence alone indicated that the gathering held significance beyond regular training. At the center of the clearing, seeress Yrsa knelt in the snow, carving runes associated with protection and fate. Her voice rose in a low chant, invoking memories of past winters marked by conflict. When she finally lifted her gaze toward Sigrid, the clearing seemed to still around them. Yrsa motioned for her to step forward. speaking in a tone that blended instruction with inevitability. "You were born in the winter after the tales of Lindisfarne spread across these lands," the seeress said. "War has shaped the years around your life, even when it did not touch your home. Today we must learn whether you will be part of its shadow or its resistance." Sigrid felt the weight of the shield settle against her arm. She tried to speak, but the words formed without conviction. She said she was not intended for battle, yet this assertion held little strength in a community where survival often dictated one's purpose. Astrid, standing close enough for her voice to be heard only by Sigrid, reminded her that few people chose their role in times of unrest. Most were shaped by the pressures of the world around them, pulled into responsibilities they had never imagined bearing. Yrsa signaled for the training to begin. Astrid handed Sigrid a wooden spear, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands. The surrounding warriors began testing her stance, striking the shield with controlled but progressively stronger blows. The sound of wood against wood echoed through the clearing, merging with the faint rustle of winter branches. Sigrid adjusted, braced, and reacted in ways that felt both unfamiliar and instinctive. Each impact pushed her further from the quiet certainty of her daily tasks and closer to an understanding of what was expected of her. When Yrsa finally raised her staff to halt the exercise, the seeress studied her with neither approval nor disappointment. Her expression carried the weight of someone who had seen many generations of young villagers forced to acknowledge the reality beyond their own hope. "Strength is not a gift," Yrsa said. "It is an expectation placed upon those who live in troubled years. Whether you resist or accept it, the world will demand your answer." Sigrid did not offer a response, but something in her posture shifted a quiet acceptance, not of war, but of the responsibility that the settlement believed she might one day need to shoulder. The silence she had grown accustomed to in her everyday life no longer carried the same comfort. It had changed into something watchful, a reminder that events unfolding along the coast would soon reach even the quiet edges of Kvigrafjord. Life in Kvigrafjord resumed its outward routine the day after Sigrid's initiation, though a subtle shift hung in the air like an unspoken agreement. The villagers moved through their tasks with deliberate focus, as though each action was part of a wider preparation still unnamed. Sigrid spent the morning repairing fishing nets along the shoreline, her hands working the fibers with practiced ease, yet every thread she pulled seemed to echo the rhythm of wooden shields striking one another in skildring. Even the gulls circling over the fjord appeared more restless, rising sharply whenever a distant sound carried from the forest paths. Gunnar Ravenson, leader of the local warband, approached the shoreline with a group of warriors returning from patrol. Their cloaks bore flecks of frost, and the metal rings of their belts sounded muted beneath layers of wool. When Gunnar paused beside her, his presence cast a long shadow across the nets. He was a man shaped by violence in the years following the Battle of Hafrsfjord, when scattered clans resisted Harald Fairhair's consolidation of power. His reputation for discipline made him both respected and quietly feared. "Yrsa says you held your shield well," Gunnar remarked, his tone neither warm nor cold. "That is not something she says lightly." Sigrid kept her attention on the knots but felt the weight of his observation. Gunnar rarely involved himself in the training decisions of women unless circumstances required it. The fact that he mentioned her performance suggested he had already been informed of decisions that affected her future. "I only did as I was told," she responded. Knowing the words sounded simpler than the truth. Her arms still ached from blocking the blows of the warriors. Her mind still replayed the runes Yrsa had carved into the snow. Gunnar watched the fjord a long moment, his expression tightening, as if he were examining something beyond the horizon. "We received word from the traders who returned last night from Hålogaland. Several longhouses were burned near Andini's. The raiders came without warning. Their leader carries a black shield, described in the same pattern as one used by the Gillen clans during the raids of 885. The mention of 885 rippled through Sigrid's memory. That year had been woven into stories around every hearth, stories of homes destroyed, of families torn apart, and of entire coastal settlements forced to rebuild from ashes. Even those who had not lived through the violence felt the weight of the date, as though it marked the beginning of a long imbalance. "So the danger comes south again?" Sigrid asked quietly. Gunnar nodded. We cannot assume otherwise. And if it does, every able body must be prepared. Yrsa believes your path lies with the defenders of this settlement. He paused, then added, Astrid will continue training you. The declaration settled like cold iron in her chest. It was not a request. It was the acceptance of something already set in motion. Gunnar's patrol continued past her, leaving her with the sounds of the fjord and the steady pulse of responsibility she had not sought but could not refuse. That evening, Astrid arrived at the longhouse carrying 2 training axes and a small leather-bound volume of carved wooden plates. She explained that the plates contained tactical diagrams used by her father Eric during the northern campaigns of 881 and 882. They depicted formations used when settlements were forced into defensive rings against raiders who outnumbered them. Sigrid studied the carvings carefully, noting how each figure was positioned to shield those beside them, how the cohesion of the group mattered more than individual strength. Astrid placed an axe in Sigrid's hand and adjusted her grip. Your arm will tire twice as fast with hesitation, she said, guiding her through a sequence of controlled swings meant to build precision before force. The rhythmic movement gradually replaced the tension in Sigrid's shoulders, although every strike reminded her how unprepared she truly felt. Training beside Astrid was like standing beside a river that ran deeper than it appeared, constant motion beneath a calm surface. As the night grew colder, Brynhild entered the longhouse, carrying herbs gathered earlier from the hillside. She watched the training quietly before handing Astrid a bundle wrapped in linen. For the bruising, Brynhild said, she will need more than one night's rest. Her tone carried no surprise, only the steady acceptance of a mother who understood the direction fate had begun to shape around her daughter. Later, when the fire burned low and Astrid departed, Brynhild sat beside Sigrid and traced her fingers along the rim of the training shield. When I was your age, they trained a few of us after word came that the raiders had reached Njarðvík, she said. Most of us never raised a shield in true battle, but every woman learned something. We learned that waiting in fear is its own kind of defeat. Sigrid absorbed her mother's words carefully. The weight of expectation no longer felt imposed by the village alone. It felt anchored in the years that came before her, shaped by stories she had heard since childhood, stories whose meanings she had not fully understood until now. The silence of Kvígurfjord that night felt different from the silence of the mornings she once cherished. It no longer suggested peace. It suggested anticipation and unsettled stillness that waited for whatever came next from the distant north. Training sessions at Skjoldring became part of Sigrid's daily rhythm, unfolding beneath towering pines whose branches had witnessed generations of warriors come and go. The clearing had long served as the heart of Kvígurfjord's defensive instruction, a place where elders blended memory with skill, and where the stories of past conflicts were passed down through practice rather than only through words. Sigrid arrived early on the first morning after Gunnar's announcement, the frost still clinging to the ground and the distant edge of the fjord reflecting a muted span of gray light. She carried the training shield, the axe Astrid had given her, and a quiet determination she could not yet name. Astrid waited in the clearing, accompanied by 2 warriors Sigrid recognized from patrol. Ragna Kolbjornsdottir, known for her precision with a spear during the expedition to Muere in 890, and Odrik Halvardsson, a veteran whose knowledge of defensive formations dated back to the contested battles along the Trøndelag borders in 878. Both greeted her with nods that suggested expectation rather than judgment. They seemed to already understand the uncertainty of someone stepping into a role shaped by necessity rather than desire. Astrid opened the session by demonstrating basic stances used during shield formations. She placed markers in the snow to show how the angles of the shield could redirect the force of incoming blows, and how small adjustments in footing prevented imbalance when multiple attackers pressed forward. Sigrid attempted each stance carefully, feeling the strain in her legs and the burn along her shoulder as the hours moved steadily on. The cold stiffened her fingers, yet Astrid insisted she adapt, reminding her that battles rarely occurred under favorable conditions. Ragna stepped in to teach spear distancing, tapping Sigrid's shield with careful strikes to help her recognize the rhythm of repeated impacts. She spoke of the raid on Ulvik in 887, a moment when those who understood timing survived, and those who panicked fell. Her voice carried the calm of someone who had lived through fear and learned to repurpose it, rather than surrender to it. Sigrid absorbed every instruction, though she felt the weight of the shield intensify with each movement. Odrik offered broader context between drills, recounting the shifts in clan alliances over the past 2 decades. He spoke of how small settlements became targets not only for raiders from across the sea, but also for rival factions within Norway, as chieftains fought to retain influence after Harald Fairhair's consolidation of power in the 870 seconds. Kvigurd, positioned along a valuable section of the fjord network, had already been noted by traders from Hålogaland as a settlement worth plundering should a larger warband descend from the north. These histories formed a quiet but persuasive foundation beneath Sigrid's training. She realized that the skills they were teaching her were not simply disciplines of war. They were expressions of survival shaped by patterns of conflict older than any single generation. As the morning wore into afternoon, Astrid shifted the lesson toward endurance. She arranged wooden stakes in the snow and instructed Sigrid to maneuver between them while maintaining a defensive posture. The exercise mirrored the chaotic environment of battlefields, where terrain, smoke, and the movement of others demanded constant adaptation. Sigrid stumbled more than once, losing her footing when the shield's weight threw her balance, yet Astrid remained steady in her guidance. She adjusted Sigrid's posture without harshness, offering calm critiques that emphasized understanding and resilience rather than perfection. By the time the sun lowered toward the tree line, Sigrid's muscles trembled from exertion. Despite her exhaustion, she recognized the beginning of a subtle shift within herself, a quiet acknowledgement that she was learning to move as the warriors did, not through inherited talent, but through repetition, observation, and an emerging familiarity with the rhythm of conflict. Her mind remained uncertain, yet her body absorbed each lesson with increasing clarity. When Astrid finally signaled the end of the day's training, she handed Sigrid a small leather pouch filled with resin. "For the grip of your axe," she explained. "Use it before the next session. Your hands will tire less." Her tone held neither praise nor discouragement, only the expectation that Sigrid would return ready to continue. As the group dispersed, Sigrid lingered in the clearing, listening to the distant sounds of the village settling into evening routines. She considered the instruction she had received, the precision of Ragnar's strikes, the tactical stories told by Odrik, and the guidance etched into Astrid's steady movements. These lessons formed a pattern she had not recognized before, a pattern suggesting that training did more than prepare warriors for battle. It forged a mindset shaped around the needs of the community, acknowledging that threats to a settlement rarely announced themselves before arriving at its borders. Walking back toward the village, she felt the presence of centuries at her back, people whose names were carved into memories of past wars, whose efforts ensured that settlements like Figrafjord endured long enough for new generations to inherit both their burdens and their resilience. For the first time, she understood that the training she received was not merely a response to danger, but an inheritance woven into the fabric of northern life. It was a lineage she had not expected to join, but one that now guided her steadily toward whatever future awaited the people of the fjord. The longhouse of Sigrid's family became a place of shifting energy in the weeks following her introduction to the training at Skjoldring. Once the heart of domestic life filled with the sound of Brynhild grinding herbs, the crackle of the hearth, and the steady rhythm of looms, it gradually transformed into a space where preparation and uncertainty mingled with everyday routine. The winter air remained sharp, carrying the scent of pine smoke through the settlement. Yet inside the longhouse, the atmosphere held the weight of unspoken conversations and quiet adjustments in behavior. Even the household objects seemed to take on new significance, as if the people who lived there could feel the world narrowing into a path that none of them had chosen. Brynhild worked through the mornings with a focus that Sigrid recognized as purposeful avoidance. She stitched heavy cloaks from wool she had stored since autumn, muttering measurements under her breath and comparing them to the garments traditionally worn by those who trained for battle. Her hands moved quickly, but her eyes betrayed the conflict she felt. When Sigrid offered to help, Brynhild accepted with a nod, though she kept her words clipped and the conversation anchored in practical details rather than in emotion. It was not a refusal to speak. It was a protective barrier forged by a mother who understood the cost of confronting fear too directly. Halfdan was quieter still. During the winters of her childhood, he had filled the evenings with stories tales of the raids on Lindisfarne in 793, the trade expeditions to Hedeby, or the uneasy conflicts that followed King Harald Fairhair's rise after the Battle of Hafrsfjord. These stories had once drawn Sigrid and Leif closer to the hearth, listening to their father describe distant lands and shifting alliances along the coastlines. Now he spoke only when necessary. His silences stretched longer, shaped by thoughts he seemed unwilling to share. At times, Sigrid caught him watching her while she practiced simple shield movements inside the longhouse, the firelight flickering against the metal boss. His gaze carried not disappointment, but a profound calculation, as if he were trying to reconcile the daughter he had raised with the woman circumstance demanded she become. Leif, still too young to fully understand the political tension surrounding Figjafjord, grew restless. Having joined Gunnar Ravenson's warband only a year earlier, he moved between excitement and nerves, confident in the idea of battle yet uncertain of what true danger meant. He watched Sigrid's training with interest, often imitating the movements with a wooden stick when he thought no one was looking. His eagerness reminded Sigrid of how she, too, once romanticized the sagas before learning they represented only fragments of the truth. During the evenings, Brynhild prepared large pots of stew that filled the room with the familiar scent of smoked fish and herbs. Sigrid found the routine comforting, even as the conversations around the hearth shifted toward cautious discussions about other settlements. News traveled from merchants passing through the fjords reports that raiders had been seen moving south from Hålogaland, that small farmsteads along the coastline had been abandoned, and that the Black Shield warband associated with the Gillen raiders of 885 had re-emerged after nearly a decade of silence. Each message layered the atmosphere inside the longhouse with another thread of tension, binding the family into a quiet readiness. One evening, as Halfdan sharpened a spearhead beside the fire, he spoke at last. Yrsa has been watching the signs, he said, focusing on the metal as it caught the firelight. Not just omens, but patterns in the behavior of traders, shifts in the seas, and the timing of raids further north. She believes Kviggurfjord may not remain untouched this season. He paused, letting the words settle. If she is correct, the settlement must rely on every capable defender. Brynhild's stitching slowed, though she did not look up from her work. Sigrid kept her eyes on the shield in her hands. The statement was not new. It had been implied in their routines, training sessions, and whispered conversations, but hearing it expressed so plainly altered the weight of it. It clarified the path that lay before her, one shaped by necessity rather than choice. Halfdan finally looked at Sigrid. Astrid is not training you without cause, he said. She trains those whom she believes can learn quickly. She has done so for others in years when danger grew near. He set the spear aside. I did not want this life for you, but I will not deny the reality of what approaches our shores. The fire crackled between them, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Sigrid felt the shield's smooth wooden edge beneath her fingers and allowed the silence to stretch. The longhouse that had always felt like a refuge now functioned as a place of preparation, a reminder that Norwegian winters did not only herald cold, they heralded shifts in the world beyond the settlement, shifts that demanded vigilance. Outside, snow continued to fall in slow, steady flakes, coating the roofs and marking the land with a softness that contradicted the grimness of the news carried along the fjord. But inside the longhouse, the family moved with the knowledge that their lives were becoming part of a larger story, shaped by past conflicts and present uncertainties. The echoes of early Viking history battlefields at Hafrsfjord, raids along the English coast, and scattered migrations across the northern seas settled into their routines as quiet reminders that survival often required adaptation from those who least expected to face war. As Sigrid placed her shield beside the hearth for the night, she understood that the coming months would test not only her skills, but the stability of everything Figjafjord had built across generations. The longhouse walls, warmed by fire and memory, no longer represented simply shelter. They had become the backdrop to a future that was slowly, inevitably, shifting toward conflict. The winter storms eased briefly as the month turned, leaving a fragile calm across Kvigorfjord that felt more like a pause than a reprieve. The settlement's fishermen ventured onto the water in small groups, their boats cutting through the pale surface with quiet precision. Yet even in these moments of temporary peace, the villagers remained alert to unusual sights or sounds. Rumors from passing traders had grown more unsettling, and each person, whether warrior or not, moved with a heightened awareness of the fjord's vast, unpredictable reaches. Sigrid accompanied her father Halfdan on one such morning to assist with repairing the northern watch platform overlooking the inlet. Built decades ago, after a small raid in 864, the structure had weathered countless winters and now required reinforcement before the heavier snows arrived. As she climbed the wooden ladder to the platform, the height offered a view she rarely experienced. The fjord stretched far beyond the settlement's boundary, its waters shifting under soft gusts of wind that carried hints of distant storms. Even the sunlight appeared muted, as though unable to penetrate the depth of the water's cold surface. Halfdan secured new beams with steady movements that reflected years of knowledge passed down from his own father, Eric Halfdanson, who had helped fortify Kvigorfjord during the unrest of the 850 seconds. His presence atop the platform offered not only guidance, but an unspoken assurance that practical tasks remained vital regardless of the uncertainty beyond the horizon. Sigrid handed him wooden pegs and coils of rope, absorbing his instructions as naturally as she once learned to mend nets or gather firewood. As they worked, the distant outline of a ship caught Sigrid's eye little more than a dark shape gliding near the mouth of the fjord. She paused, shading her view against the glare of snow. "There," she said, pointing. "A vessel. Do you see it?" Halfdan followed her gaze, his expression firming when he spotted the same shape drifting with deliberate movement rather than the aimless bob of a fishing boat. He measured its silhouette carefully. "It is too far to mark clearly," he murmured, "but it rides deeper in the water than the boats from Hålogaland. Perhaps a merchant vessel, though merchants seldom sail alone this time of year." The ship disappeared behind a curve in the fjord, leaving them with unanswered questions that lingered long after its departure. Halfdan returned to his work, yet Sigrid could sense the shift in his demeanor. A single vessel was not cause for alarm, but its presence, paired with the ominous news from northern settlements, hinted at a pattern forming across the coastline. When they returned to Kvigorfjord, Gunnar Ravenson was already organizing a small patrol. Sigrid overheard fragments of conversation, reports of unfamiliar ships near Bergen, accounts from a family fleeing the burning of a small settlement near Fulda, and warnings that the Black Shield warband had resurfaced in raids as recent as the previous fortnight. The stories converged into a narrative too consistent to dismiss. Something was gathering in the north, and its movement southward appeared deliberate. Sigrid sought Astrid later that day, finding her in the blacksmith's shed, working alongside Ragna Kolbjornsdottir. The forge crackled with heat, casting warm light on the tools and weapons laid out across the workbench. Astrid hammered a strip of iron meant to reinforce the rim of a young warrior's shield, while Ragna shaped the point of a new spear. The smell of smoke and hot metal filled the air, grounding the space in work that balanced craft and anticipation. Sigrid relayed what she had seen from the watch platform. Astrid listened without interrupting. When Sigrid finished, the older woman exchanged a glance with Ragna that conveyed understanding more than surprise. "Gunnar has already heard similar sightings," Astrid said. "The ships are not close enough to confirm their allegiance, but we cannot assume they carry peaceful intent. Traders do not approach fjords uninvited, and raiders seldom travel singly." Ragna wiped the iron filings from her hands and examined Sigrid with the measured scrutiny of someone assessing readiness beyond physical skill. "If the Black Shield warband is moving south again," she said, "they will target areas along the fjord they believe cannot muster rapid defense. Kvigorfjord is small enough to appear vulnerable, yet strong enough to fight back if prepared. That makes us a test for whatever force they gather." Astrid returned to her work, striking the iron with a steady rhythm that seemed to mirror the tone of her voice. "What you saw is not a sign of immediate battle, but it confirms the underlying truth. We must train harder and move with greater vigilance. When ships appear without signal, they are rarely solitary for long. The remainder of the day stretched into a blur of preparation. Warriors inspected their weapons, elders evaluated food stores, and Brynhild coordinated with several families to reinforce shared structures. Sigrid assisted wherever needed, carrying bundles of kindling, checking the hooks along the longhouse walls, and joining Leif in mending rope used for securing livestock during storms. These tasks carried a sense of urgency not because danger was imminent, but because the settlement understood how quickly chaos could descend once the first flames were lit on a distant shore. That night, as Sigrid stood outside watching snow drift in soft spirals, she recalled the ship's dark silhouette against the fjord. It had been only a brief sighting, but it lingered with weight, hinting at forces already in motion far beyond Kvivjord's reach. The fjord, once a comforting boundary, now seemed to stretch endlessly, its waters concealing not just the movement of boats, but the intentions of people shaped by conflict and ambition. The shadows along the fjord deepened into the quiet of night, and Sigrid understood with growing certainty that the village's fragile calm would not hold much longer. Whatever approached from the north had marked the coastline with purpose, and Kvivjord stood waiting in the narrowing space between vigilance and inevitability. The following morning brought word from a messenger who arrived just after sunrise, his clothing stiff with frost and his horse marked by a long ride through uneven terrain. He had come from Hergarstead, a settlement nearly a day's journey southeast, known for its gatherings during times of uncertainty. His arrival was not unexpected. Traders and scouts had passed through Kviggerfjord in recent weeks, carrying pieces of troubling accounts, but the messenger's presence confirmed that the surrounding communities were beginning to coordinate their response. The man introduced himself as Tormund Einarsson, a scout serving under Jarl Kettle of Hergarstead. His voice carried the fatigue of long travel, yet his message remained clear. Jarl Kettle has called for representatives from all nearby villages, he said, standing in the center of the longhouse while the elders listened with quiet focus. Ships with unfamiliar markings have been seen off the coast near Naroi, and also farther south near Agdenes. Houses were burned near the settlement at Leikven, and survivors believe the attackers were testing their strength rather than seeking wealth. At the mention of Leikven, murmurs rippled through the gathered villagers. The settlement had existed for more than 30 years and was known for its defensive wall built after the harsh raids of 867. It had withstood attacks before, but the idea of it being tested rather than plundered unsettled the room. Brynhild, seated among the elders, leaned forward and asked Tormund for details. Were the attackers identified, she said. Did survivors speak of shield patterns or banners? Tormund nodded faintly. They reported a dark boar painted on several shields. The same mark was seen during the attacks led by the Black Shield warband in the mid-862s. But the survivors said the fighters moved as though under new leadership. Their formation was tighter, their retreat deliberate. These were not disorganized raiders. The elders exchanged glances. Stories of the Black Shield warband had passed through Kviggerfjord for years, though the group had faded from the coastline after a failed assault near Lade in 873. If they had reorganized or worse, aligned under a more ambitious leader, the threat extended far beyond small skirmishes. Such coordination implied planning, resources, and a strategy that stretched across settlements rather than isolated boats. Gunnar Ravenson stepped forward, his expression steady. "We will attend the gathering," he said, "but we must also ensure that Kviggerfjord is prepared to stand on its own should trouble reach us before alliances take shape." The meeting dispersed shortly after, though the atmosphere throughout the village shifted perceptibly. The prospect of a regional gathering at Hergarstead invoked both reassurance and apprehension. These meetings were rare, usually held during severe winters, disputed claims, or threats from rival coastal groups. Their purpose was to create a unified response, but unity often came only after substantial debate, and time was a resource not always available. Astrid prepared to travel with Gunnar, Brynhild, and two younger warriors, Svanhild Ulfsdotter and Torsten Arnkelsen. They represented a balance of experience and youth, chosen to listen, observe, and report back. Sigrid assisted Astrid as she packed, laying out wool cloaks, water skins, and small offerings traditionally carried to such assemblies. Dried fish, carved bone tokens, and bundles of juniper branches meant to symbolize protection. As Astrid folded a cloak, Sigrid asked, "Do you believe the gathering will change anything? Or will settlements simply wait as they always do, hoping danger will pass by without claiming them?" Astrid paused before answering. "Change rarely comes from meetings alone," she said, "but it creates a voice stronger than any one village can muster. Hergarstead has faced raids before, and Jarl Kettle does not call a gathering lightly. If he believes the threat is growing, then others will take it seriously." She adjusted the fastening of her cloak and added, "But even with alliances, each settlement must decide how it will respond when danger reaches its own boundary. Puvjord cannot rely on others to stand for us." Sigrid absorbed the words with a growing sense of responsibility. Though she was not yet counted among the warriors of the village, the decisions made in Hergarstead would shape her future as much as anyone's. She watched as Astrid and the others mounted their horses and rode south, their figures fading into the thin winter mist. For a moment, the village felt unusually quiet, as though its breath had been drawn in, waiting for what news the riders would return with. Later that day, Sigrid walked toward the northern overlook, where she had first seen the unfamiliar ship. She carried a small wooden bucket of fresh water for Leif, who was repairing loose stones along the path. The work seemed endless, but each task contributed to the settlement's resilience, and Leif approached it with his usual methodical focus. He accepted the water gratefully. "Astrid will return with something solid," he said between drinks. "Not reassurance, perhaps, but understanding. We cannot guard against shadows." Sigrid nodded. "But we can watch for their movement." Leif smiled at the reply, though the expression carried weight beneath its surface. He gestured for her to look out across the fjord. "Do you see the calm in the water?" he asked. "When the tide moves like this, it means a shift in the currents. The sea prepares for something long before we notice it." The fjord lay still, except for faint ripples near the inlet. The quiet did not comfort her. Instead, it heightened her awareness that change had already begun, and the discussions at Hergarstead would merely reveal the first shape of a larger force gathering along the coast. By nightfall, the settlement resumed its usual rhythm of tending fires, feeding animals, and preparing for the cold hours ahead. Yet beneath these tasks was an undercurrent of anticipation. Every person, from the elders to the youngest children, knew that the gathering at Hergarstead would determine not only their strategy, but their place within the broader defense of the northern coastline. As Sigrid stood outside her family's longhouse, she noticed the stars flickering sharply above the fjord, their reflection trembling upon the dark water. The world beyond Kvivjord no longer felt distant. It pressed closer with each report, each sighting, each story of burned homes and tested defenses. The gathering at Hergarstead had begun, even before the riders reached the hall. The journey to Hergarstead carried Astrid, Gunnar, Brynhild, Svanhild, and Torsten across narrow ridges and frozen streams, the kind that forced riders to slow their pace and remain watchful of shifting ground. By midday, a thin veil of snow began to fall, drifting lightly across the landscape without obscuring the path. The old road they followed had taken shape decades earlier, when traders regularly traveled between the coastal settlements and the inland farms near Vangrolt. Astrid recognized several markers carved into standing stone spirals, runic initials, and dates marking previous rebuilds after storms or landslides. As they approached Hergarstead, the settlement emerged in layered silhouettes. The outer houses formed a wide semicircle around the central hall, with smoke rising from nearly every chimney. Beyond them stood the old Hearing Rock, a massive formation where disputes had traditionally been settled. It had been present long before the settlement itself, and was referenced in accounts from as early as 839, when a boundary conflict between two farming families had supposedly taken place upon it. The rock now served as a symbolic guardian over the gathering. Inside the main longhouse, the atmosphere was tense but orderly. Representatives from 6 settlements were already present, including those from Leikven, Naroi, Rørstad, Hovland, Agdenes, and Torgar. Each carried their own expressions of fatigue, worry, or controlled resolve. Jarl Ketil stood near the central hearth, speaking quietly with a woman named Runa Thorbjornsdottir, one of the few scholars in the region known to keep detailed records of events, sightings, and disputes. Her presence suggested that this meeting would be documented for future reference. Ketil raised his hand when he noticed the arrival of the Kviggjord delegation. "Welcome," he said, his voice steady, carrying authority without force. "Your settlement stands closest to the inlet where the unfamiliar ship was seen. Your observations may shape what comes next." Gunnar stepped forward, offering a respectful nod. "We saw the ship 2 mornings past. Its hull was unfamiliar, and its course indicated deliberate scouting rather than travel. There was no banner, no visible crew, and no trade signal." Ketil exchanged a glance with Jorund Arnason of Agdenes, who confirmed that a similar vessel had been spotted near their coastline. "They did not land," Jorund said, "but they lingered long enough that we believed they were measuring distance to our harbor." Runa unrolled a small piece of parchment containing rough sketches made during previous sightings. The drawings were not exact, but they shared recurring details: a narrow prow, a darkened hull, and shields lined along the side in a manner that differed from the traditional placements used by the northern coast settlements. "The alignment of the shields," Runa noted, "matches neither Frisian nor Danish patterns from the last decade. It resembles a design recorded during raids near Melhus in 874, though at that time the markings were inconsistent." Astrid observed the sketches and pointed to a detail near the prow. "This carving," she said. "It is similar to the pattern described by survivors from the Leikven skirmish." They mentioned a boar's head painted black, outlined by ash. Runa nodded. "Yes, a symbol previously associated with a fragmented warband operating between 864 and 872. Their leader from that period, Hrolf Arngirsen, was said to have been killed near Kaupang. Yet there were no witnesses to confirm the death, only accounts of a burning ship sent adrift. The mention of Hrolf brought a shift in the room. The warband he commanded had been known for sudden attacks that focused on isolating smaller communities. While his tactics lacked the precision of larger raiding groups, they were effective enough to instill fear in regions otherwise accustomed to conflict. Ketil addressed the gathered representatives. "We cannot assume Hrolf lives, but we must recognize that someone is now commanding fighters under the same banner. Whoever they are, they test our borders with purpose." The discussion broadened to reports of burned homes near Leikven, damaged boats near Rørstad, and a missing fishing crew from Hovland, who had not returned since venturing out 3 days earlier. Brynhild listened closely, noting patterns in behavior that suggested reconnaissance rather than random aggression. Torsten Arnkelsen, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. "If their intent is to weaken settlements before a major assault, then they may avoid direct confrontation until they are certain of our defenses. That means these sightings are only the first signs." Ketil agreed. "Our response must be coordinated, not reactive. Each of you will return to your settlements with a shared directive: increase patrols, strengthen watch positions at coastal points, limit isolated travel, and most importantly, send reports of any sighting, no matter how small, to Hergarstead within a day." Runa added, "We will maintain a written record. Patterns often reveal themselves before intent does." As the gathering continued, smaller councils formed within the hall. Leikven's representative discussed the possibility of rebuilding their defensive wall. Agdenes proposed the creation of a signal system using controlled fires on cliff points. Naroi's group shared descriptions of unfamiliar tracks found near their western ridge, deep impressions suggesting movement of supplies or heavier equipment. Astrid remained near the hearth, listening while maintaining a reserved posture. The more she heard, the more she believed the threat extended deeper inland than many realized. The attackers were not simply targeting homes, they were studying the coastline. By late afternoon, the meeting drew to a close. As the delegations prepared to depart, Ketil approached Astrid directly. "Your settlement stands in a vulnerable position," he said. "The inlet near Kviggjord is narrow, but it provides an ideal landing point if an enemy wishes to strike quickly." Astrid met his gaze with steady composure. "We understand the risk, We will strengthen our watch. Kettle placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of respect rather than reassurance. Be vigilant. The movements we see now are not isolated acts. They are steps in a larger design. When Astrid and her companions departed Hergarstead, the sky had begun to dim, and torches glowed along the main road. The hall behind them continued to buzz with conversation, though the tone had shifted from concern to preparation. The gathering had served its purpose. It had clarified the threat, revealed its reach, and forced each settlement to confront the same conclusion. What was approaching would not be a single raid. It would be a campaign. The path home felt heavier beneath their horses' hooves, and the wind carried a chill that seemed to underscore the urgency of all they had heard. Astrid glanced back once more at the distant silhouette of the hall before turning toward Kvigrafjord. The coast would not remain quiet for long. The return to Kvigrafjord carried an immediate awareness that something within the settlement had shifted since the group's departure. The air above the shoreline felt heavier, as though the winter wind had paused long enough to listen. Astrid, Gunnar, Brynhild, Svanhild, and Torsten moved quietly along the narrow path leading toward the central clearing, their boots pressing into the frozen earth in a rhythmic pattern that seemed too loud for the day's muted stillness. Even the gulls circling above the inlet moved without their usual sharp cries, and the smoke from the longhouse chimneys drifted in low, uneasy trails across the rooftops. The watchtower, a structure originally raised under Arnulf Ketilsson's direction during the hard winter of 861, normally held a single guard who watched the entrance of the fjord with casual vigilance. Now 3 figures stood at the top of the tower, each maintaining a rigid stance. 2 carried spears angled outward, while the third peered over the horizon using a bronze-fitted scope that had been acquired from Hedeby merchants in 874. This shift in protocol, though subtle, reflected a sense of alertness that required no verbal explanation. People paused in their work to glance upward, their faces betraying tensions they had not yet spoken aloud. Freydis Hrolfsdottir emerged from a side path near the storage sheds and approached Astrid with a pace unusual for a woman known for her steady composure. Freydis had survived the coastal famine of 867 and the devastating storms of 858, and her movements had always been measured. The urgency in her steps revealed more than her words, as she said that the settlement had expected the group sooner because sightings along the southern cliffs had renewed the fears already growing throughout the fjord. She explained that lights had been seen before dawn, moving across the ridge near Skarvik, an area known for shipwrecks dating back to the gales of 842. The torches Freydis described had been spaced evenly, as if marking distance or mapping terrain, and the way they moved suggested organization rather than wandering travelers. Brynhild listened attentively, watching the reinforced doorways of the storage huts nearby, and asked who had witnessed the event. Freydis replied that a young boy named Arn Joransson had seen the lights while gathering wood with his father. According to them, there had been 5 torches in total, all moving in a deliberate line. By the time others reached the cliffs, the ridge had fallen dark again. The group then proceeded to speak with Leif Ragmoldsson and Olmod Ketilsson, 2 respected fishermen repairing nets toward the shoreline. Leif had commanded men during the 870 skirmish at Hrafnvik, while Olmod was known for documenting celestial events, including the bright meteor of 873 that had illuminated the northern sky for 3 nights. Leif greeted Astrid with concern and asked whether Jarl Kettle had confirmed their suspicions. Astrid answered directly, stating that the threat extended beyond Kvikjord and that similar observations had been recorded in various settlements from Torgar to Agdenes. Leif then guided them to a section of the beach where a broken ship fragment had washed ashore. When Astrid brushed away the frost, the painted emblem of a black boar's head became visible beneath the ice. Gunnar examined the fractured edges of the wood and noted that the break suggested recent damage, likely caused by rough waters close to their own coastline. Olmod supported this conclusion by explaining the patterns of the southern current, which would not have carried debris from distant waters to this specific point. The evidence implied that the unfamiliar vessel had passed uncomfortably near the fjord. With the sky growing dim under heavy afternoon clouds, the settlement gathered in the longhouse. This structure, originally built in 829 and expanded over the decades, was known for its remarkable acoustics. A single voice near the hearth could be heard clearly across the entire hall. Astrid addressed the villagers with a calm authority, summarizing the findings from Hergarstead and relating them to the sightings and discoveries along the coast. Torsten explained the pattern of torch movements, while Brynhild showed the shield fragment to those gathered. The painted boar's head sparked numerous recollections among older residents, who remembered similar symbols from the conflicts of the mid-860s. Svanhild emphasized the need to assume that the enemy was conducting reconnaissance, and Eric Kolbeinson recommended establishing watch rotations extending beyond the tower to the northern ridges and the forest trail leading to Vangrolt. The group also discussed coordinating coastal watchfires similar to those proposed in Agdenes, allowing the fjord to signal awareness rather than isolation. As the discussion progressed, villagers recalled earlier years of hardship, famine in 867, storms in 858, rival clan raids in 872, each memory becoming part of a broader understanding that the present threat required clear-minded preparation. Before the gathering ended, Gunnar reminded the settlement that early warning granted them an advantage that other villages had not possessed in earlier decades. Astrid added that preparedness would depend not solely on strength, but also on continuous vigilance. Once the meeting dispersed, families moved toward their assigned watch posts, and others secured their homes for the approaching night. As darkness settled across Krivjord, Astrid walked near the watchtower, listening to the subdued rhythm of the waves breaking against the shore. She looked toward the horizon where sea and sky merged into a single shadowed line. Whether the enemy waited behind the fog, beyond the cliffs, or upon waters just out of sight, the truth remained that Krivjord was no longer hidden. Someone was studying the land, and whoever they were, their intentions were deliberate and calculated, marking the beginning of an uncertain chapter for the settlement. The first coordinated night watch in Kvigirfjord began under a sky that carried no moon, only a faint scatter of stars, resting behind thin layers of winter cloud. The settlement had weathered many difficult season storms in 858, the lean winter of 867, the raids of 872, but there was a shared understanding that this night marked a turning point for the fjord. The villagers moved deliberately, gathering along designated paths and preparing torches, spears, signaling horns, and small round shields reinforced with rawhide. The longhouse, usually a place of conversation at day's end, had emptied earlier than usual as families withdrew to their homes or took their places in the watch lines. Astrid oversaw the formation of the patrol groups. She stood near the tower entrance, marking names on a carved slate that had once recorded fishing quotas in 860. Groups were arranged to include both experienced fighters and those accustomed to navigating the uneven terrain of the cliffs and forest edge. Gunnar led one of the first patrols, accompanied by Svanhild, and two younger men, Einar Kolbeinson and Halvard Johnson, chosen for their sharp vision and steady discipline. Brynhild remained at the tower to assist with signaling and maintain a clear view of the fjord's mouth. Torsten, who understood the coastal routes better than most, guided another patrol toward the southern ridges above Skarvik. These were the same cliffs where the 5 torches had been sighted before dawn, and the night wind carried memories of previous incidents that had occurred along those steep stones. Torsten recalled the year 842, when a sudden gale had dashed 3 vessels against the rocks and forced survivors to climb the cliffs in total darkness while waves broke below them. The terrain had not changed since then. Even the narrow ledges worn by centuries of salt spray still held the same precarious angles. As Torsten's group moved along the ridge path, the only sounds were the crunch of frost beneath their boots and the muted roar of waves striking rock. A thin mist rolled upward from the water, drifting across the ledges in slow patches. One of the patrol members, a woman named Bjorga Arnorstottir, paused to study the distant stretch of shoreline where a faint glow flickered. She pointed toward it, but Torsten signaled to wait. The glow faded before they could determine whether it had been a fire, a reflection, or the trick of shifting clouds. Meanwhile, along the forest edge near Vangrold Path, Astrid led her own patrol. She walked beside Olmod Kettleson, whose habit of marking celestial events had made him unusually attentive to visual detail. The forest was dense with spruce and pine, their branches holding pockets of ice that glimmered faintly whenever the torches shook in the wind. The group advanced in a slow formation, stopping at regular intervals to listen. At one point, Olmod raised his hand and identified a distant echo resembling wood striking stone. The group monitored the area for several minutes, but the sound did not repeat. Svanhild and Gunnar's patrol navigated the narrow western trail overlooking the inlet. This ridge had been used as a lookout point during the attempted raid of 872, when a rival clan had tried to approach under heavy fog. Gunnar explained to Einar and Halvard how the earlier defenders had placed their torches low to the ground to confuse the approaching raiders about the height of the cliffs. The torches now carried served a different purpose, marking their exact position so that signals could be seen clearly from the tower. At intervals throughout the night, the watchers rotated positions. Brynhild, stationed at the tower, kept careful note of each patrol's movements using a map engraved on a flat piece of driftwood recovered in 854. She checked the horizon frequently, studying the faint patterns of reflected light that lingered over the water. Once, near the middle of the night, she thought she saw movement along the sea's edge, a glimmer, like a lantern shielded by a hand, but it vanished before she could call down a report. Inside the tower, a signal horn carved decades earlier during the leadership of Jarl Arnvid Thorson hung beside the stairway. It had been used only a few times in the past 30 years, most notably during the coastal fire of 856. Brynhild's hand brushed the horn as she moved past it, reminding herself that if the enemy approached, their warning must travel across the settlement faster than torchlight alone could deliver it. As the patrols progressed, small discoveries began to surface. Gunnar's group found a length of rope snared between two jagged stones along the inlet. It appeared worn and salt-stiffened, possibly torn from a ship's rigging, and its frayed ends suggested recent damage. Astrid's patrol located footprints along the forest path, not the broad, deep impressions of boots commonly worn in Fjord, but narrower tracks that seemed to belong to lighter shoes designed for quick movement. Torsten's group identified a wooden stake driven into the ground near the cliff's base, angled toward the shoreline in a way that suggested it may have been used to mark distance or position. Each small detail reinforced the conclusion they had already reached. The settlement was being observed, and the observers knew how to move without drawing attention. Throughout the night, families in the village kept to their homes, lighting only enough fire to warm their rooms. Parents explained to children that the quiet outside meant protection, and the sounds they might hear were patrol groups passing by. Elder Bjorn Gudmundsson, who rarely left his hearth due to injuries sustained during a distant conflict in 846, sat awake with a spear across his knees, listening for any unusual sounds along the side path behind his house. His experience added a layer of calm to those living nearby. The night advanced slowly, marked by the watch changes at regular intervals. When Astrid's patrol crossed paths with Gunnar's, she exchanged information regarding the footprints and rope. Brynhild updated them on the uncertain light seen at the horizon. Torsten's group added the discovery of the stake. Each detail, while small on its own, formed part of a larger pattern that they documented carefully on the driftwood map once they returned to the tower. By the time the first suggestion of dawn began to rise, a pale gray band stretching faintly above the eastern ridge, the settlement had completed its longest coordinated night watch in decades. The patrols converged near the longhouse, where the hearth was rekindled to warm those who had spent the night outdoors. People gathered quietly, sharing what they had found. There was no celebration and no immediate relief, but rather a steady understanding that their vigilance had prevented the unknown forces from moving closer without detection. Astrid studied the gathered villagers, recognizing the fatigue in their eyes, but also recognizing the unity that had grown in a single night. Fjord had faced storms, raids, and scarcity, yet this moment felt different. The threat they faced did not arrive with noise or certainty, but rather with silence and calculation. The settlement had responded in kind, choosing discipline over fear. As the light grew stronger across the fjord and the long shadows of the watchtower stretched across the waking village, Astrid understood that this night had only been the beginning. The enemy that lingered beyond the coastline had measured the land. Now Kvigriord had measured them in return, readying itself for whatever the next movement in the unfolding conflict would bring. Morning came to Kvigriord with a pale, colorless light that barely touched the water's surface. The previous night's watch had left the settlement alert but exhausted. Even so, the villagers moved with quiet determination, as Astrid gathered a small team for further investigation along the shoreline. The sea had always been both a provider and a threat to the fjord. Its tides carried fish in abundance during good seasons, but it had also brought wreckage, storms, and on rare occasions, omens. The discovery of the shield fragment had shifted attention toward what might be lurking beyond the waves, and Astrid knew the coast held answers they had not yet uncovered. Gunnar accompanied her, along with Brynhild, Svanhild, and a fisherman named Hovard Elifsson. Hovard's family had lived beside the fjord since the early years of the settlement's founding in 821, and his familiarity with the underwater contours made him invaluable to their search. He guided them toward a series of stone outcroppings that jutted into the water like ancient teeth, marking the entrance to one of the deeper channels. During the late summer of 862, a trading vessel had nearly capsized here when an unseen current pulled it sideways, a memory that remained firmly etched in the community stories. As the group approached the shoreline, Hovard pointed to a cluster of gulls circling above a narrow strip of beach. The birds descended repeatedly, not in a feeding frenzy, but in slow, deliberate patterns. Gunnar noted that gulls behaved like this only when drawn to an unfamiliar object. When the tide receded far enough, they located the source, a piece of hull timber caught between two rocks. It bore faint traces of tar and pitch not commonly used among the settlements of the northern coast. Brynhild knelt beside the timber, brushing aside wet sand. Though the markings were worn, she recognized a pattern etched along one edge, a sequence of intersecting lines similar to the navigation symbols used by Eastern traders who passed through Bjarmaland in the 860 seconds. But here, the lines differed slightly, as though adapted by a group with its own methods and destinations. She studied them in silence, realizing this fragment suggested more than scouting it, suggested a vessel designed for long-distance travel and precise movement. Hovard stepped into the shallows, the water rising past his boots. He scanned the fjord's mouth, tracing in his mind the likely route such a vessel would have taken. He explained that the deeper channel lay only a few strokes beyond the surface, forming a natural path that would allow a foreign ship to slip through with minimal risk of grounding. He added that the currents near the southern cliffs, intensified by underwater ridges formed during the storms of 848, could easily conceal movement. The implication was troubling. A ship could have followed the coast at night without being seen until it chose to reveal itself. Svanhild placed her hand on the timber fragment and considered the possibilities. She recalled accounts from Agdenes, where villagers had heard sounds at night resembling oars striking water in irregular intervals. If the same vessels were responsible, they were gauging not only the land, but the reactions of the people who lived along it. She turned to Astrid and said the reconnaissance felt too measured to be merely opportunistic. Astrid agreed. Whoever commanded these ships possessed knowledge of fjord navigation that rivaled their own. Gunnar proposed that they explore the shoreline more thoroughly. They moved along the coast, searching for additional signs of passage. Near a section of flattened rock covered in kelp, Svanhild found a set of impressions where something heavy had once rested. The marks were deep and rounded, spaced evenly apart. Hovard recognized them as the impressions left by the supports of a small landing frame, a lightweight structure used by seafaring bands to stabilize boats during brief shore stops. Such frames were not common along the northern coast, and their presence confirmed that the enemy had not merely passed by but had anchored, even if only for moments. The group continued down the beach until Hovard stopped abruptly. He pointed toward a narrow inlet where the water turned darker, reflecting the rising sun in subdued fragments. Something beneath the surface shifted slow, almost imperceptible, as though a shadow moved against the current. Gunnar stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sea axe. The shadow drifted again, longer this time, extending toward the point where a cluster of rocks created a natural break. Hovard crouched at the water's edge and tested the temperature, then listened to the movement below. He explained that the shifting dark mass was not a creature, but a series of submerged objects being carried by the tide, objects heavier than driftwood. As the next wave rolled out, one of them surfaced briefly. Astrid recognized it instantly, a segment of woven rope identical to the one found during the night watch, though this piece was thicker and coated in tar. The rope drifted for a moment before sinking again into the deeper channel. The presence of these submerged items suggested that a significant portion of a vessel or its equipment had broken apart nearby. Brynhild speculated that the ship had encountered trouble along the cliffs, or had deliberately jettisoned weight. Gunnar considered another possibility. The fragments might not result from damage, but rather from preparation. Some raiding groups were known to lighten their ships before approaching foreign shores to increase maneuverability. If that were the case, the broken pieces they had found were not signs of weakness, but evidence of planning. As the tide continued to retreat, they discovered a final piece of evidence, lodged between two slabs of stone, a small iron hook attached to a strip of leather. The craftsmanship, while crude, differed from the designs used in Vigerfjord and its neighboring settlements. Hovard examined the hook closely and remarked that it resembled equipment used to fasten cargo nets aboard Bjarmelin merchant ships decades earlier. Its presence suggested the enemy had encountered such traders or adopted their techniques. Astrid gathered the items they recovered and arranged them on a flat stone, reviewing each detail in silence. The rope, the timber, the landing frame impressions, and the hook formed a scattered but coherent picture. The forces surveying the fjord were not opportunistic raiders drifting along the coast. They were organized, equipped, and familiar with technologies and practices not common in their region. The group returned to the village with the evidence, and by midday, the longhouse filled once again with quiet discussion. Hovard's analysis of the underwater channel, Brynhild's observations of the navigation symbols, and Svanhild's account of the landing marks were considered carefully by the settlement's elders. The conclusion emerged with steady clarity. The enemy was not simply studying the land, they were studying how Kvigerfjord lived, moved, and responded. As evening approached, the fjord's waters darkened once more, returning to the calm surface that concealed everything beneath. Astrid stood at the shoreline a long while after the meeting ended, listening to the muted rumble of the waves. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a ship or its remnants drifted in silence. Whether it had withdrawn or only hidden itself for a time remained uncertain, but she knew the sea rarely kept its secrets for long. The echoes beneath the water had revealed the first fragments of truth, and she sensed that the next discovery would not be found along the shore, but inland, where the forest paths held shadows of their own. The forest of Vengrot stretched across the eastern edge of Kvigerfjord, like an old guardian whose patience had grown thin with age. Its pines and spruce, shaped by decades of harsh winters, bent slightly inward, forming a canopy that muted the light even in early afternoon. Few villagers walked its deeper paths during colder seasons, not because of danger, but because the forest carried an uneasy stillness that made people feel watched. When Astrid, Brynhild, Svanhild, Torsten, and Gunnar entered its shadowed interior the morning after the shoreline investigation, they did so with deliberate steps, each aware that the forest held answers the fjord had not offered. The previous night's discovery of foreign footprints had raised immediate questions. The impressions near the forest trail had been narrower than the boots worn in Kvigerfjord, and seemed to have been made by at least two individuals moving in close formation. Olmod Kettelson's earlier observation during the night watch, that the prints followed a precise pattern rather than the wandering steps of hunters, suggested the movement was intentional. Astrid believed that if the enemy had approached by sea, then the forest would be their natural route of inland exploration. The group began at the same narrow bend where the prints had first been observed. The morning frost had softened slightly, preserving only the deeper marks left from the night before. Brynhild crouched at the edge of the path, brushing aside a layer of pine needles. The impressions were faint now, but still visible enough to study. She noted the spacing between the steps and the slight inward tilt of each heel. The pattern was unfamiliar, lacking the broader, heavier imprint typical of Viking footwear. Gunnar concluded that the individuals who passed through were lighter in build or carried less equipment, possibly scouts. Svanhild examined the tree trunks nearby. One of them bore a small cut near its base, a shallow, angled mark made by a blade sharper than the seax commonly used in the settlement. It resembled the deliberate notches used by some eastern travelers to mark their routes. If the enemy had adopted similar practices, it meant they intended to navigate this forest again. Astrid recorded the location of the mark with a charcoal stick on a scrap of parchment. Noting the direction it pointed, Torsten moved ahead a few paces and signaled for silence. The forest floor dipped into a shallow depression where patches of moss had been disturbed. In the center lay a small piece of fabric, snagged on a protruding root. Brynhild picked it up carefully. The cloth was coarse and dark, dyed with a pigment that did not match the natural dyes used in Kvigafjord. It bore a faint scent of smoke and salt, suggesting its wearer had been aboard a ship recently. The group pressed deeper into the forest. Here, the trees grew closer together, their trunks narrowing the path until only two people could walk side by side. The light dimmed, filtered through branches that had held their needles long into the winter. They moved slowly, scanning for signs of passage, bent branches, disturbed lichens, impressions left where someone had paused too long. Torsten identified another set of notches, these carved higher on a tree trunk. The placement indicated a deliberate attempt to track elevation, an uncommon practice among local hunters who relied on memory rather than markings. About halfway into Van Grolt Wood, the group reached an area where the scent of damp earth intensified. A faint trail veered away from the main path, leading toward a grove of birches. Svanhild recognized this place from her childhood, a sheltered clearing used during the summer of 864 for gathering wild herbs. But now the ground bore marks that did not belong to any natural activity. Large sections of soil had been scraped aside, leaving shallow trenches. One trench, no more than the length of a forearm, contained the remnants of a fire pit. Brynhild sifted through the ashes and found charred fragments of fish bones, mixed with a resinous substance she did not recognize. Gunnar tested the edges of the trench. The soil crumbled easily under his fingers, suggesting the fire was recent, less than a day old. Astrid felt a tightness in her chest as she realized the group they were tracking had not merely passed through the forest. They had camped here, possibly observing the settlement from an inland vantage. Hovard Eilifson, who had joined the patrol for his knowledge of regional plant growth, examined the surrounding vegetation. Several of the ferns closest to the pit had been pressed down, as if someone had rested against them. He also noted the broken stems of a medicinal herb commonly used to treat fatigue during long treks. Whoever camped here had prepared for sustained travel, carrying provisions suited for both land and sea. As they documented the camp remnants, Torsten found a narrow stretch of ground where two sets of footprints overlapped. The prints pointed in opposite directions, one set leading deeper into the forest, the other returning toward the shoreline. He speculated that the scouts had split briefly, one surveying the inland routes, while the other returned to report their findings. This pattern mirrored tactics used by reconnaissance groups in coastal conflicts recorded in the early 860s. Astrid instructed the group to follow the deeper trail. It wound between thick roots, eventually descending toward a ravine carved centuries earlier by meltwater. The ravine's stone walls produced a faint echo with every step, magnifying the sound of their movement. Brynhild paused at the ravine's center and pointed toward a cluster of subtle indentations, a series of prints arranged in a semicircle. She explained that they were consistent with individuals pausing to observe something. The direction of their gaze, judging by the orientation of the footprints, aligned with a narrow gap between the trees where the rooftops of Kvigafjord were just visible through the winter haze. The realization settled heavily. The scouts had watched the settlement from this exact spot. Gunnar considered the implications. If the enemy knew the layout of the fjord, they might be determining where defenses were weakest, or where approaching forces could remain unseen. Astrid examined the ground once more, and found a small iron shard near the observation point. The shard bore marks consistent with tools used to carve wooden stakes, similar to the one found at the cliffs. The repeated appearance of such equipment suggested a coordinated survey of the landscape. Further along the path, the forest thickened again, muffling the wind. The group moved until they reached a small ridge overlooking a dry creek bed. Here, the footprints faded entirely. Svanhild suggested that the scouts might have climbed the ridge and descended on the other side, where the terrain became rocky and difficult to track. Torsten added that beyond the ridge lay an old path that eventually circled back to the southern cliffs. If the enemy had wanted to map a complete route from sea to forest and back again, this would be the logical ending point. They stood at the ridge in contemplative quiet, absorbing the breadth of what they had uncovered. The forest, once thought of merely as a natural boundary, had become a corridor through which the enemy had moved with confidence. Every footprint, every notch, every remnant of a campfire was a sign that Kvigfjord's interior had been studied more thoroughly than any of them had imagined. By the time the group returned to the village, the light was beginning to wane. The findings were brought before the elders once more, and as the settlement listened to the description of the scouts' path, a deeper understanding took shape. The threat they faced was intelligent, organized, and methodical. The enemy was not simply testing the periphery of the fjord, but learning its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, and its routes of retreat. As night fell again over Kvigfjord, the forest loomed in the distance, silent and watchful. Astrid, standing near the longhouse door, glanced toward the darkened tree line, knowing that the next phase of their struggle would depend not only on guarding the coast, but on understanding the paths that ran beneath the forest canopy. The shadows of Vangrold Wood had revealed a careful and deliberate presence, one that had come and gone without being seen, and one that would almost certainly return. Snow began to drift across Kvigfjord as evening settled around the settlement. The flakes moved in slow, deliberate spirals, carried by a wind that whispered along the rooftops and slipped through the narrow lanes between the houses. The longhouse, warmed by the deep fire at its center, became the gathering point for a council unlike any held since the Stormyear debates in 858. Villagers filed in with cautious steps, brushing snow from their cloaks as they took places along the benches that lined the hall. Astrid stood near the hearth with Gunnar, Brynhild, Svanhild, and Torsten, each prepared to present the discoveries from both sea and forest. The elders were among the first to settle themselves. Hjördis Arnmatsdottir, who had endured the famine of 867 and still carried the quiet authority of someone who remembered every hardship, sat beside Elder Bjorn Gudmundsson, whose injuries from the Battle of 846 had not diminished his sharp attention. With them sat Orm Ketilsson, who had presided over trade negotiations in 875 and kept a meticulous record of regional alliances. Their presence grounded the meeting, ensuring that the settlement's long history informed the decisions to come. Astrid began by recounting the forest investigation. Her voice remained steady as she spoke of the footprints, the notched trees, the fabric scrap, and the remains of a concealed campsite. She explained how the placement of each mark suggested deliberate navigation rather than chance wandering. She emphasized the vantage point overlooking the settlement, where the scouts had paused long enough to observe the layout of Kvigfjord. The villagers listened closely, absorbing the detail with expressions that shifted slowly from concern to recognition. Brynhild then described the shoreline findings, the fragment of hull timber with unfamiliar navigation patterns, the tar-coated rope, the broken landing frame impressions, and the iron hook. Her explanation of the symbols etched into the timber drew murmurs. Hjördis leaned forward, recalling a similar pattern seen on a merchant vessel that had drifted near the coast during the trade famine of 862. Orm Ketilsson observed that the adaptation of navigation techniques from distant regions indicated not only contact with foreign traders, but also a level of sophistication beyond simple raiding bands. Torsten addressed how the forest marks and shoreline remnants formed a unified path. He drew a rough diagram onto the driftwood map that Brynhild had used the previous night, tracing a looping route that began at the southern cliffs, cut through Vangrold Wood, circled the ravine, and returned to the coast. The path demonstrated that the scouts had created a full survey of the fjord's landscape, identifying vantage points, terrain weaknesses, and potential approaches for a larger force. Gunnar expanded on this by discussing the tactical implications. He explained that the scouts had moved with the precision of reconnaissance groups used during the conflicts of the 860 seconds, when rival clans competed for dominance along the coast. He noted that their campfire trench suggested a short stay but careful positioning, and their trail patterns indicated discipline and experience. He added that the underwater fragments found near the channel revealed that the enemy's ship had moved close enough to the fjord to risk damage, which meant the group was confident in their knowledge of local waters. When the initial presentations ended, the longhouse fell into a measured silence. The elders exchanged glances, acknowledging the weight of the gathered evidence. It was Hjördis who finally spoke, her voice low and thoughtful. She recalled how, in 853, a distant settlement had ignored early signs of scouting along their borders and had paid a costly price when a full raid arrived weeks later. She urged caution but insisted on preparation rather than panic. Her recollections carried credibility, anchoring the villagers' emotions to a historical perspective they trusted. Elder Bjorn drew from his memories of the conflicts near Vithamiri in 846. He described how opposing forces had used similar reconnaissance strategies, studying the land before committing to attack. He emphasized that the advantage lay not with the aggressors, but with the defenders, who recognized the pattern early enough. He reminded the village that they had already shown vigilance through their coordinated night watch and unified response. Orm Ketilson offered a broader interpretation. He observed that the markings, tools, and ship fragments suggested a group with mixed influences, possibly a band that had traveled widely or absorbed techniques from multiple regions. He speculated that they may have encountered Bjarmaland traders, southern navigators, or even former clans seeking new territory. If so, their chosen target would not be accidental. Kvígurfjord, with its sheltered waters and defensible terrain, offered strategic advantages worth claiming. As the council absorbed these perspectives, Astrid introduced the question that had lingered beneath all their findings. How much time did they have before the enemy returned? The room stirred as villagers shifted on their benches, looking toward one another. The answer could not be known, but the patterns observed in both forest and shore suggested that the scouts had already completed much of their route. Brynhild noted that such reconnaissance often preceded a larger movement by a matter of weeks or even days, depending on how far the enemy's main fleet traveled. Discussion turned toward defense. Torsten proposed expanding watch rotations further into the forest and along the cliffs, ensuring no part of the fjord remained unobserved. Brynhild added that they should establish elevated warning positions along the ridge where the scouts had watched the settlement. Gunnar suggested reinforcing vulnerable paths with obstacles and gathering additional weapons from neighboring settlements, while they still had time to prepare. Several villagers voiced their willingness to participate in watch lines, including those who had historically taken limited roles in defense, such as woodcutters, fishermen, and carpenters. They recognized that the threat required unity beyond traditional roles. Even the younger villagers, many born after the conflicts of the 860 seconds, understood that their participation would determine the fjord's safety. Svanhild brought attention to the importance of communication with surrounding settlements. She explained that Hergarstead, Agdenes, and Torgar had also reported unusual sightings. A coordinated message system, whether through runners, signal fires, or boats, would allow the fjord to respond quickly if the enemy appeared along neighboring coasts. The council continued long into the evening, shifting between strategy and memory, between present danger and past survival. The longhouse fire cracked steadily, sending sparks upward in brief arcs before vanishing into the rafters. Snow thickened outside, muffling the sounds of the village and enclosing the settlement in a blanket of pale silence. By the time the meeting concluded, the people of Kvígurfjord had accepted that the scouts' presence signaled more than simple curiosity. The enemy was gathering knowledge, evaluating weaknesses, and identifying points of entry. But the settlement had also done something rare in times of uncertainty. They had gathered as a unified community, prepared to meet the threat with clarity and resolve. Astrid stepped outside after the council dispersed. The air was cold enough that her breath curled in faint spirals. She looked toward the dark silhouette of Vangrolt Wood on one side, and the faint glimmer of the shoreline on the other. The fjord lay between them like a silent witness to the choices being made. Whatever force watched them from beyond the cliffs or beneath the waves would find that Kvigrfjord had already begun to answer. The snowfall eased by morning, leaving Kvigrfjord coated in a thin crystalline layer that softened the edges of every roof and pathway. Smoke rose from chimneys in slow ribbons, drifting toward the pale horizon where the sky hovered between gray and blue. The settlement moved quietly, as though the previous night's council still echoed through the longhouse walls. People went about their tasks with a steady purpose, but conversations fell into hushed tones whenever the forest or the coastline came into view. The scout's presence had unsettled something older than fear, something rooted in memory. Astrid spent the early hours speaking with families who lived on the outskirts of the village, gathering observations from anyone who had seen or heard anything unusual. Most had nothing new to report, but they shared stories passed down from their parents and grandparents, tales of shadowed figures, warnings of foreign sails, and seasons when the fjord had appeared calm, even as danger crept closer. Astrid had heard many of these stories before, yet they carried a new weight now that recent events had mirrored so many of their details. Gunnar accompanied her, stopping to assist an elderly woman, Liv Eriksdottir, as she stacked bundles of firewood against the side of her home. Liv had lived through the raids of the early 852nd and possessed an unshakable confidence shaped by years of hardship. When Astrid asked whether she had seen anything along the path near the northern ridge, Liv shook her head slowly before recounting an old tale her mother had told her, a tale of travelers who moved in silence, mapping the land by marking trees and placing stones in hidden configurations. Though the story had been passed down as folklore, its resemblance to the recent forest discoveries could not be ignored. Brynhild, meanwhile, had gone to speak with Arn Joransson, the boy who had first seen the torches along the cliffs. She found him near the edge of the settlement, practicing with a small wooden bow. He explained again what he had seen: 5 torches moving in an unwavering line, each held at a consistent height. Brynhild encouraged him to describe the brightness, flicker, and spacing, and as he spoke, she realized the torches were likely covered by windshields, curved pieces of wood used by some southern raiders to protect flames during reconnaissance. Their use pointed to deliberate planning, not improvisation. Svanhild spent her morning studying the marks discovered in Vangrolt Wood. She carried with her a piece of charcoal and a length of birch bark, sketching the patterns of the tree notches, the spacing of the footprints, and the arrangement of the campsite trenches. When she compared them to markings she had seen during her travels to the market village of Eikfjord years earlier, where traders from across the north occasionally passed, she was struck by the familiarity of the notches. They resembled a practice attributed to a seafaring band, known for their precise land surveys during the late 862nd, though it was unclear whether that group had disbanded, merged with others, or simply continued under a new name. As the morning deepened, Torsten walked to the shoreline to inspect the tide. The water's edge had shifted since the previous day's discoveries, revealing new patches of rock and sand. He followed the tide line, scanning for additional debris. A few gull feathers, a length of kelp, and a fragment of driftwood were all that remained. But as he moved closer to the southern inlet, he spotted something wedged between 2 stones, a piece of bone carved with a faint spiral design. He turned it over, recognizing it as a charm often carried by travelers for protection at sea. The charm was fashioned in a style he had rarely seen one associated with distant coastal groups known for their unpredictable movements. He carried the bone charm back to the longhouse, where Gunnar, Astrid, Brynhild, and Svanhild had begun organizing their findings. As they gathered around the central table, Torsten described where he had found the charm and how unusual the design was. Brynhild took the charm in her hand, examining the spiral pattern closely. It reminded her of designs carved into artifacts recovered from a wrecked vessel that had washed ashore near Haldalen decades earlier. That ship had belonged to a group traveling far beyond common trade routes, and the survivors had disappeared without explanation. The similarity in design suggested a connection, either direct or through shared influence. The group began discussing how these fragments, stories, and markings tied together. Gunnar noted that several elements pointed toward a disciplined reconnaissance force with a history of absorbing practices from various coastal cultures. Astrid added that the consistency of the scouts' movements and the locations they had observed hinted at long-term objectives, not a single-season raid. Svanhild suggested that the group may have traveled from beyond the northern archipelagos, where records were sparse and stories abundant. Torsten remarked that the combination of navigation symbols, tree notches, and campsite remnants resembled a pattern recorded during the reconnaissance of 865, when a group had briefly surveyed settlements between Jarnholt and Vestervik, before vanishing for 2 full winters. As they continued comparing evidence, Hjordis entered the longhouse, carrying with her a series of carved wooden tablets. The villagers quieted as she set them gently on the table. These tablets, passed down through her family since the mid-840s, preserved records of sightings, encounters, and warnings that had occurred along the coast for more than 3 generations. She opened them one by one, pointing to symbols etched beside certain years. In the records for 847, 861, and 868, she indicated small clusters of lines and curves resembling the patterns Brynhild had identified on the hull fragment. She explained that her ancestors had believed these marks belonged to a group that traveled the coastline in cycles, appearing every decade or so to observe and withdraw. The room fell into a thoughtful hush as the implications settled in. If the scouts belonged to a similar or related group, then their presence in Kvigjofjord was part of a much older pattern one, stretching across multiple generations and regions. It would mean that the enemy had not appeared due to immediate opportunity, but according to a larger plan or tradition. Orm Ketilsson, upon studying the tablets, suggested that the cyclical nature of the sightings might correspond to the group's expansion, migration patterns, or attempts to establish footholds along different fjords. Astrid felt the weight of this possibility. If the enemy's intentions extended beyond opportunistic raids, if they followed a long-standing practice of surveying and testing coastal settlements, then Kvigjofjord's situation was more precarious than it had appeared. Their presence marked not a singular threat, but the next step in a recurring cycle. The villagers who had gathered listened intently as the group continued piecing together historical accounts, comparing them to recent observations. The stories passed down from elders began to feel less like distant warnings and more like living evidence. The echoes of the past revealed patterns that mirrored the present, suggesting the scouts' arrival was not unexpected to those who had lived long enough to remember the older stories. By late afternoon, the hearth glowed brighter as more wood was added to fuel the long discussion. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the settlement wrapped in quiet white frost. Figerfjord, with its familiar rhythms and history etched into every ridge and inlet, now stood at the threshold of understanding a threat older and more persistent than anyone had realized. Astrid looked around the longhouse, noting how each villager had become part of a larger narrative stretching beyond their own lives. The scouts who walked in silence through Vangrolt Wood and along the southern cliffs were not simply measuring the land, they were continuing a story written long before Kvigjord existed. And if the cycle held true, the next chapter in that story would bring challenges unlike any the fjord had faced before. Winter deepened across Kvigjord by the time the council's preparations settled into routine. The sea froze in patches near the shoreline, and the forests grew still beneath the weight of fresh snow. What had begun as scattered signs along the outer paths now formed a pattern that could no longer be called coincidence. The disturbed markers, the foreign cloth, and the precision of the fire pits all pointed toward a presence that moved with intention, observing the land from its quietest corners. No open threat had yet appeared, but the watchers no longer seemed distant. They had become a part of the landscape, as real as the wind that shaped the drifts along the ridges. Astrid spent the following weeks traveling between settlements, helping to align watchposts and boundary markers from Steinvik to the inland valley of Hrafnjefjo. The work brought her into contact with women and men, whose names rarely appeared in the sagas, but who carried generations of knowledge about the land. In Lirfjord, she met Runa Otarstottir, whose family kept records of migration patterns dating back to the time of King Hakon Sigurðarson. South in Bjarnaholt, she walked the old paths with Arn Sveinsson, who remembered the last winter when foreign sails had been seen on the horizon. Their accounts differed in details, but shared a single thread. When unfamiliar eyes turned toward the fjords, the land itself seemed to grow sharper, as though listening for what would come next. One morning, near the middle of Jol month, Astrid climbed the ridge above Kvigjord with elder Brynja. The sky stretched gray and heavy above them, and the valley below lay silent except for the distant creak of ice forming along the inlet. From this height, they could see the placement of every marker and the winding trail of the river where the old farms once stood. Brynja studied the landscape with a calm that came from many seasons of guiding the settlements through harder years. Brynja observed that the watchers, whoever they were, had not pressed into the heart of the settlements. They had tested the outer boundaries, noted the markers, and moved along the ridges without crossing into farms or longhouses. It suggested reconnaissance, not conquest. Astrid considered this as she looked toward the distant coastline where the stories of unfamiliar vessels had begun. She wondered if the watchers were assessing the fjords for weakness or simply learning their shape before committing to something larger. That evening, messengers returned from the northern inlet of Ravenstrand, reporting new findings. Carved patterns had been discovered on fallen trees near the shoreline, markings unfamiliar to the local woodworkers. The carvings were angular, almost geometric, and repeated in intervals as if forming a coded message. Such markings did not match the runes of the fjords, nor the decorative cuts made during seasonal rituals. They were deliberate, but for a language no one in the settlement knew. Astrid and Torsten examined the carvings the next day. They noted the consistency and spacing, the sharpness of the cuts, and the way the lines angled toward the sea. Torsten believed they might serve as directional markers for those approaching from the water. Astrid agreed, though she said little. The evidence now formed a complete trail, from the coastline to the ridges, from the markers to the fire pits. The watchers had circled the fjord in a path that resembled a survey or mapping. They were learning the land with precision. The settlements gathered in Kvigjord's longhouse for one last council before the turn of the year. Representatives from Hergarstead, Agdenes, Ravenstrand, and Raphael attended. The air inside the hall felt weighted with the knowledge carried by each arrival. No one spoke of war, for nothing yet indicated that the watchers sought conquest. Instead, the discussion centered on readiness, how to preserve the fjord's autonomy, how to strengthen the signaling paths, and how to maintain vigilance through the remaining winter months. Every settlement agreed that the markers would stay in place until the ice melted and the sea routes reopened. Astrid stood among the speakers, but avoided making strong declarations. She knew the land better than most, yet she felt the weight of uncertainty in a way others did not. The watchers had not revealed themselves, and until they did, the settlements walked a line between fear and preparation. The hall reached a consensus to remain cautious, keep record of all disturbances, and share findings as the season progressed. When the meeting ended, Astrid stepped outside into the night. Snow fell in sparse flakes, drifting across the open field behind the longhouse. Torches burned along the outer posts, their flames moving with the wind. She walked toward the riverbank, where the frozen water reflected the dim light of the sky. The quiet there felt different, not dangerous, but attentive, as if the fjord itself had entered a long moment of awareness. Brynja joined her, leaning gently on her staff. She said that the fjords had survived storms and raids long before either of them had been born. The settlements had weathered famine, strife, and the shifting tides of neighboring kingdoms. Whatever approached, whether a new people, a scouting party, or something else entirely, the fjords would respond in their own rhythm, shaped by generations of memory. Astrid listened, letting Brynja's words settle into the cold air. She understood then that the watchers were not the conclusion of a story, but the beginning of another. The strength of the fjords did not lie in their weapons or their walls. It lay in the knowledge carried quietly across seasons, in the networks of footpaths, in the women who kept the records and the hunters who learned the movement of wind against snow. As Astrid gazed down the valley toward the distant sea, she traced the outline of the markers in her mind. Each stood as a reminder that the land held more history than any single generation could understand. And somewhere beyond the outermost ridge, The watchers continued their silent passage, mapping the fjords with intentions still unknown. The long memory of the land would record this winter, just as it had recorded the winters before. The fjords would hold their shape. The watchers would reveal themselves in time. And those who guarded the valleys, women like Astrid, Brynja, Ingrid, Runa, and many others, would be the ones who met whatever arrived at the edge of the snow.